The transport ship groaned against the San Francisco dock on a morning thick with fog, the kind that wrapped around everything like wet cotton and made the world feel smaller than it was. Keiko pressed her palm against the cold metal wall of the holding area below deck, feeling the vibration of boots above. American soldiers moving with purpose, their voices deep and incomprehensible through the steel. She was 23 years old, though she felt centuries older. The war had aged all of them in ways that had nothing to do with time. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "They're opening the doors," whispered Yumi beside her, her voice barely audible over the sound of chains being removed from the hatch. Yumi was 19, with hands that still trembled from the months they'd spent in the internment facility in the Philippines after their field hospital had been overrun. They'd been nurses, all 47 of them, tending to wounded Japanese soldiers in the Pacific Theater. Now they were prisoners, being transported to the continental United States for reasons no one had bothered to explain in a language they understood. Keiko had learned 3 English phrases during the sea voyage: "Yes, sir," "Thank you," and "I understand." She didn't understand much of anything, but the phrase seemed to calm the guards when they barked instructions that sounded like gravel being churned in a metal drum. The hatch opened with a screech that made several women flinch. Light poured down, gray and diffused through the fog, but after days in the dim hold it felt like staring into the sun. Keiko squinted upward and saw a silhouette, a man's shape, broad-shouldered and impossibly tall, reaching down with one hand extended. "Come on up, miss," the voice said, surprisingly gentle. "Watch your step there." Keiko had seen American soldiers before, of course. In the Philippines, they'd been the enemy firing from distant positions, shadows in the jungle, voices shouting over gunfire. But she'd never been this close, never looked directly up at one offering assistance. She hesitated, cultural instinct warring with practical necessity, then reached up and grasped his hand. The shock of it registered in several ways at once. First, the size. His hand completely engulfed hers, rough with calluses but careful in its grip. Second, the strength. He pulled her up the ladder as if she weighed nothing. One smooth motion that left her standing on the deck before she'd even registered movement. Third, the height. When she found her footing and looked up, she had to crane her neck at an angle she'd never used in Japan, where even the tallest men rarely exceeded 5 feet 8 inches. This soldier was at least 6'3", maybe more, with shoulders that blocked out a portion of the gray sky. His face was square-jawed and sunburned, with eyes the color of shallow ocean water. He was still holding her hand. "You all right, miss?" he asked, and Keiko realized she'd been staring with her mouth slightly open. She quickly bowed, a reflex, and withdrew her hand. "Yes, sir," she managed, her accent thick. "Thank you." Behind her, Yumi emerged from the hatch, and Keiko heard her friend's sharp intake of breath. Then Tomoko, then Sachiko, each one stopping for a moment at the top of the ladder, eyes widening as they took in the scene on deck. There were at least 20 American servicemen arranged in 2 lines, creating a pathway toward the gangplank. Every single one of them towered over the women emerging from below. It wasn't just height, though that was striking enough. It was the breadth of them, the way they seemed to occupy space differently, their bodies built on a different scale entirely. Arms that looked like they could lift twice Keiko's weight without effort. Hands that could probably span the circumference of her waist. Faces so large and features so pronounced they seemed almost exaggerated, like characters from the American films that had occasionally made it to Tokyo before the war. "Are they all giants here?" Yumi whispered in Japanese, moving close to Keiko's side. "I thought the propaganda was exaggerating." During the war, Japanese media had portrayed Americans as brutish and oversized, using their physical presence as shorthand for moral degeneracy. Keiko had assumed it was caricature, the same way American propaganda probably drew Japanese people with exaggerated features. But standing here on the deck, she felt like a child among adults, like she'd stumbled into a world built for a different species. "Single file, please," called out an officer from the gangplank, gesturing with broad movements. "Nice and slow. Watch your footing. Decks slippery from the fog." The women moved forward in a silent line, their lightweight canvas shoes making no sound on the wet deck. Keiko noticed how the soldiers watched them with expressions she couldn't quite read. Curiosity, certainly, but also something that might have been surprise. Were they shocked by how small the women were? By how young some of them looked? By the fact that they were prisoners at all? One soldier, younger than the others with red hair that stuck out from under his cap, leaned toward his companion and murmured something. His friend elbowed him sharply and shook his head, but not before Keiko caught the tone. Not hostile, but bewildered, as if he couldn't quite reconcile the idea of these small, exhausted women as enemy combatants. As Keiko walked down the gangplank, she kept her eyes on her feet, but she could feel the weight of attention, the strange energy of being so physically outmatched by every person around her. In Japan, she'd been of average height, unremarkable in a crowd. Here, she felt like a sparrow among hawks. The dock opened up before them, and beyond it, through the thinning fog, Keiko caught her first real glimpse of America. Buildings rose in the distance, taller than anything in Tokyo except the Imperial Palace. Cars lined the streets. So many cars, more than she'd ever seen in one place, each one gleaming and huge. The air smelled different, a mixture of salt water, diesel fuel, and something cooking that made her stomach clench with unexpected hunger. "This way, ladies," called another voice, and a woman stepped forward from a military vehicle parked nearby. She was an American nurse, judging by her uniform, and she was tall too. Not as tall as the male soldiers, but still several inches taller than any of the Japanese women. Her hair was the color of corn silk, pulled back in a neat bun, and her face had an openness to it that Keiko found unsettling. In Japan, nurses maintained a careful professional distance. This woman was smiling. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Morrison," she said, speaking slowly and clearly. "I'll be your liaison during processing. I know you've been traveling for a long time, and you must be exhausted. We're going to take you to the facility where you'll be staying. There will be food, clean clothes, and hot water for bathing. Does anyone speak English?" Keiko raised her hand slightly, then immediately felt self-conscious about the gesture. "Little," she said. "I speak little." Lieutenant Morrison's smile widened. "That's wonderful. What's your name?" "Nakamura Keiko," she said, then corrected herself, remembering that Americans put family names last. "Keiko Nakamura. Nice to meet you, Keiko. Can you help translate for the others? I want to make sure everyone understands what's happening." Keiko nodded and turned to her companions, speaking quickly in Japanese. "She says we're going to a facility. There will be food and baths. She seems kind." "It's a trick," said Fumiko, one of the older nurses at 35, her voice hard with suspicion. "They're softening us before the interrogations." "Maybe," Keiko admitted, "but we don't have much choice, do we?" They were herded, gently but herded nonetheless, toward a line of military trucks. More soldiers appeared to help the women up into the truck beds, and Keiko found herself once again confronted with the physicality of these men. The soldier who helped her, a different one this time, with dark skin and kind eyes, placed his hands on her waist and lifted her bodily up into the truck as if she were a child. She felt her face burn with embarrassment and something else she couldn't quite name. Inside the truck bed, the women huddled together on the bench seats, clutching their small bags of possessions. Through the canvas opening at the back, Keiko watched San Francisco roll past. The streets were wider than any she'd known in Japan, the sidewalks crowded with people who all seemed impossibly large and impossibly diverse. She saw black men in suits, white women in dresses that showed their calves, Chinese shopkeepers arranging goods in windows. The sheer variety was overwhelming. "Look at their food," Yumi breathed, pointing to a market they were passing. Even from the truck, Keiko could see the abundance, mountains of fruit, rows of canned goods, fresh bread piled in baskets. It had been months since she'd seen food displayed so casually, so carelessly abundant. In Japan, even before the war, such plenty had been rare. During the war, it had been unimaginable. The truck climbed a hill, and Keiko caught a glimpse of the Golden Gate Bridge through the fog, its towers rising like the gates to another world. She thought about her mother back in Kyoto, if she was even still alive. She thought about her younger brother who'd been drafted and sent to Burma. She thought about the soldier whose hand she'd held on the deck, the casual strength in his grip, the way he'd called her Miss, as if she were a person rather than a prisoner. Something had shifted in the 30 seconds between climbing out of the hold and stepping onto American soil. Some fundamental understanding of the world and her place in it had been quietly rearranged. These men, these Americans, they weren't the demons from the propaganda posters. But they weren't quite human in the way she understood human either. They were something else. Something that made her feel small and visible and frighteningly aware of her own vulnerability. "Keiko?" Yumi whispered, gripping her arm. "What's going to happen to us?" Keiko looked at her friend's frightened face, then around at the other women, all of them small and exhausted and far from home. Through the canvas, she could see Lieutenant Morrison riding in the truck's cab, her blonde hair catching what little light filtered through the fog. "I don't know," Keiko said honestly, "but I don't think they're going to kill us." It wasn't much comfort, but it was all she had to offer. The truck continued climbing, carrying them deeper into America, into a world where everything, the buildings, the food, the people, was built on a scale they'd never imagined. The facility was a converted military barracks in the hills above San Francisco, a collection of long wooden buildings painted the same dull green as the trucks that had transported them. It was surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire, but the gates stood open, and Keiko noticed there were no guard towers. This wasn't a prison in the traditional sense, though they were certainly not free to leave. Lieutenant Morrison led them into what had once been a mess hall, now converted into a processing center. Long tables were set up with stacks of forms, and American soldiers sat behind them with clipboards and pens. But before any of that, there was food. The smell hit Keiko first: roasted meat, fresh bread, something sweet and unfamiliar. Her stomach, which had learned to stay quiet during months of rice gruel and occasional fish, suddenly came alive with a hunger so intense it made her dizzy. "Please sit," Lieutenant Morrison said, gesturing to tables already laden with plates and bowls. "Eat first. Everything else can wait." The Japanese women exchanged glances, still standing in a tight cluster near the door. It felt like a trap, though Keiko couldn't articulate why. Nothing was free, especially not from enemies. But then Fumiko, the eldest and usually the most cautious, took a step forward. "If they wanted to poison us, they could have done it on the ship," she said in Japanese. "I'm too hungry to care anymore." That broke the spell. The women moved to the tables, settling onto chairs that felt sturdy after weeks of sleeping on hard surfaces. Keiko sat between Yumi and a quiet girl named Akari who'd barely spoken since the Philippines. A soldier approached their table, another tall one, though Keiko was starting to realize they were all tall, carrying a large pot. He was older than most of the others, maybe in his 40s, with gray threading through his dark hair and a gentle smile that created deep creases around his eyes. "Beef stew," he said, ladling generous portions into their bowls. "Made it myself this morning. Got carrots, potatoes, good beef from Marin County. Bread's on the table, help yourselves." Keiko stared down at her bowl. There was more meat in this single serving than she'd eaten in the past 6 months combined. The vegetables were huge, cut into chunks the size of her fist. Steam rose from the surface, carrying a rich, savory aroma that made her eyes water. "Thank you," she managed in English, and the soldier's smile grew wider. "You're welcome, miss. There's plenty more if you want seconds. Or thirds." He moved on to the next table, his large frame somehow managing to project comfort rather than threat. Keiko picked up her spoon, a real metal spoon, not the wooden utensils they'd been given on the ship, and took her first bite. The flavor exploded across her tongue, rich and complex, the meat tender enough to fall apart without chewing. She closed her eyes involuntarily, and when she opened them again, she saw Yumi crying silently into her own bowl, tears mixing with the stew as she ate. Around the room, similar scenes played out. Women eating with a desperate intensity, some crying, some laughing in disbelief, some simply staring at their plates as if they might disappear. The American soldiers watched with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to discomfort, clearly unprepared for the emotional response. Lieutenant Morrison moved through the tables, pausing here and there to speak with the women. When she reached Keiko, she crouched down so they were at eye level, a gesture that surprised Keiko with its thoughtfulness. "How is it?" she asked. "Very good," Keiko said. And then, reaching for words she'd learned years ago in school, "Very generous. Thank you." "You're welcome. Listen, after you eat, we need to do some basic paperwork, names, ages, backgrounds, medical history. Nothing invasive, I promise. Then we'll show you to your quarters. They're not luxurious, but they're clean and warm. Each of you will have your own bed with clean sheets. There's a bathhouse with hot running water. And tomorrow we'll start talking about what happens next." What does happen next?" Keiko asked, her English faltering over the complex question. Lieutenant Morrison's expression grew serious. "Honestly, we're still figuring that out. The war just ended a few months ago, and nobody quite knows what to do with female POWs. You're nurses, not soldiers, which complicates things. For now, you're safe here. That's what matters." She stood up, and Keiko was once again struck by her height, the way her head nearly reached the top of Keiko's seated position. Everything here seemed designed to remind Keiko of her smallness, though she sensed it wasn't intentional, just a natural consequence of existing in a place built by and for people who occupied space so differently. After the meal, they were processed one by one. Keiko sat across from a young corporal whose name tag read Johnson. He had sandy blonde hair and freckles across his nose, and he looked like he was maybe 20 years old. He held a pen that seemed almost comically small in his large hand. "Full name?" he asked. "Nakamura Keiko." He wrote it down carefully, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. "Age? 23. Occupation before the war? Nurse. At hospital in Kyoto. How'd you end up in the Philippines?" Keiko paused, unsure how to explain in English the complex web of duty, family pressure, and youthful idealism that had led her to volunteer for overseas service. "I wanted to help," she said finally. "Japanese soldiers need nurse. I go." Johnson nodded, writing. Then he looked up at her, really looked, and she saw something shift in his expression. "My sister's a nurse," he said quietly. "She's in France right now with the Army Nurse Corps. I worry about her all the time." It was such an unexpected piece of information, such a sudden humanization, that Keiko didn't know how to respond. She settled for, "I hope she is safe." "Me too." He cleared his throat and went back to his form. "Any medical conditions we should know about? Injuries? Illnesses?" They went through the rest of the questions, and then Johnson stood to escort her to the next station for a basic medical examination. Walking beside him, Keiko's head barely reached his shoulder. She found herself acutely aware of the disparity. The way his stride was so much longer than hers that he had to consciously slow his pace. When they reached the medical tent, he held the flap open for her. "Good luck, Miss Nakamura," he said. I hope things work out for you." The medical examination was conducted by a female Army doctor, Captain Elizabeth Chun, who was Chinese-American and spoke some basic Mandarin but no Japanese. Still, her presence was less intimidating than the male soldiers had been, even though she was also tall by Japanese standards. "Malnourished but recovering," Captain Chen murmured to her nurse as she examined Keiko. "Some old bruising here on the ribs. Signs of prolonged stress. Vitamin deficiencies, definitely. We'll need to start them all on supplements." She turned to Keiko and spoke slowly. "You're going to be okay. We'll get you healthy again." By the time Keiko was led to the barracks that would serve as their dormitory, darkness had fallen. The building was long and narrow, with rows of metal frame beds lining both walls. Each bed had a thin mattress, 2 blankets, a pillow, and clean white sheets folded at the foot. Compared to the bunks on the transport ship or the concrete floors in the Philippines facility, it looked like a luxury hotel. The women claimed beds in small clusters, staying close to friends and familiar faces. Keiko chose one near the center, with Yumi on one side and Tomoko on the other. They changed into the plain cotton nightgowns that had been provided, all of them sized for American women and therefore comically large on their small frames. "I feel like I'm wearing a tent," Yumi said, holding out her arms. The sleeves extended well past her fingertips. Someone laughed. A sound so unexpected after months of grimness that it made everyone stop. It was Sachiko, barely 18, her nightgown hanging off her shoulders like a dress. She started laughing harder. And then Tomoko joined in, and suddenly the whole barracks was filled with the sound of 47 women laughing at the absurdity of nightgowns designed for people twice their size. It was Fumiko who finally spoke what they'd all been thinking. We're like children here. In this country, we're the size of children. The laughter died down, but the tension had been broken. Women began talking in small groups, sharing observations from the day, speculating about what would happen next. "Did you see the nurse who examined me?" said Hannah from across the room. Her hands were so big she could barely take my pulse properly. She had to use 3 fingers where she'd normally use one. "The soldiers keep trying to help us with everything," added Michiko. "Opening doors, carrying things. That one with the red hair tried to carry my bag, which weighs almost nothing. I think he thought it would be heavy." "They're afraid to touch us," observed Keiko. "Have you noticed? They're so careful, like we might break." "Maybe we look breakable to them," Yumi said softly. "Maybe we are, compared to them." Keiko thought about that as she climbed into her bed, feeling the give of an actual mattress beneath her for the first time in months. The lights were turned down but not completely off, a concession to the fact that they were still, technically, prisoners. Through the window, she could see fog rolling in from the bay, turning the fence line into a ghostly boundary between here and there, between this strange new world and the one they'd left behind. She thought about Corporal Johnson's sister in France, about Lieutenant Morrison's genuine smile, about the old soldier who'd made them beef stew with such care. She thought about the casual strength in every gesture, the way even simple acts like opening doors or lifting supplies were accomplished with an ease that seemed almost superhuman from her perspective. In Japan, strength had been about discipline, endurance, the ability to withstand hardship. Here, it seemed to be simply a fact of existence, as natural as breathing. These Americans didn't have to try to be strong. They just were, built on a different scale, shaped by a land of abundance she was only beginning to comprehend. "Keiko?" Yumi whispered in the darkness. "Are you afraid?" "Yes," Keiko admitted. "But maybe not in the way I expected to be." The fear wasn't about violence or cruelty. It was about becoming invisible, about being so small in this place that she might simply disappear. It was about learning to exist in a world where everything, every chair, every doorway, every person, reminded her that she didn't belong, that she was built for a different place entirely. But she'd survived the war. She'd survived the Philippines, the transport ship, the uncertainty of not knowing if she'd live to see another day. She could survive this too, this strange challenge of being small in a land of giants, of being powerless in a place of impossible strength. Tomorrow, Lieutenant Morrison had said, they would start talking about what happened next. Tonight, Keiko would sleep on clean sheets in a warm bed, her stomach full for the first time in months, surrounded by women who'd survived the same nightmare. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a foghorn sounded its long, mournful note across the bay. The first week passed in a blur of routine and revelation. Each morning, they were woken at 7 by a gentle knock on the door rather than a harsh command. Another small mercy that felt significant. Breakfast was served in the mess hall. Eggs, bacon, toast with butter, orange juice from real oranges. Portions that would have fed a Japanese family for days, served to each woman individually. Keiko began to understand that the American notion of enough existed on an entirely different scale than anything she'd known. Not just food, but everything. Soap that lathered richly, towels thick enough to wrap around twice, shoes with rubber soles that didn't wear through after a month. It was as if the entire country operated under the assumption that there would always be more, that scarcity was an aberration rather than the natural state of things. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Lieutenant Morrison established a daily English class in the afternoons, taught by a civilian teacher named Mrs. Patricia Donovan, who'd volunteered to help. Mrs. Donovan was in her 50s, shorter than most Americans Keiko had met, maybe 5'6", but still several inches taller than the tallest Japanese woman in the group. She had gray-streaked brown hair and a warm, patient manner that reminded Keiko of her favorite teacher from nursing school. "Let's start with practical phrases," Mrs. Donovan said on the first day, writing on a chalkboard in clear, careful letters. How to ask for things you need, how to express basic needs and feelings. Keiko found herself becoming the unofficial translator for the group, a role that brought both privilege and burden. She sat in the front row, notebook open, trying to capture not just words but meanings, the subtle differences between what was said and what was meant. In America, Mrs. Donovan explained, we tend to be more direct than in Japanese culture. If you need something, it's okay to ask for it. If something is wrong, it's okay to say so. This might feel uncomfortable at first, but it will help you communicate better. The concept was foreign to all of them. In Japan, directness was often considered rude. You were supposed to understand what someone needed without them having to ask, to read the air, to maintain harmony through careful indirection. But here, Keiko was learning, silence and subtlety could be misinterpreted as consent or confusion. On the third day, something happened that would become a turning point. They were in the exercise yard, a fenced area behind the barracks where the women were allowed to walk for an hour each afternoon. It was a clear day, rare for San Francisco, and Keiko was standing with Yumi near the fence, looking out over the city below. The view was spectacular. Buildings stacked on hills, the bay glittering in the distance, cars moving along streets like insects on a trail. A group of soldiers was working nearby, repairing a section of the fence that had come loose. Keiko had learned some of their names. Private Miller, a tall young man from Iowa with an easy smile. Sergeant Rodriguez, broad-shouldered and quiet. Corporal Washington, who always tipped his cap when he passed the women. And Private First Class Kowalski, who had a thick accent and was teaching himself Japanese from a phrase book. "Miss Nakamura," Kowalski called out, waving. "Come here, please. Need help with word." Keiko walked over, curious. Yumi followed, always reluctant to be left alone. Up close, the size difference was even more pronounced. All four soldiers were well over 6 feet tall. Kowalski had to crouch down to show Keiko his phrase book, and even crouching, his eyes were level with hers. "This word," he said, pointing. "How do I say it? The book has the letters, but I don't know the sound." Keiko looked at the word, Tomodachi. "Friend," she said in English, then pronounced the Japanese carefully. "Tuemodachi." "Tuemodachi," Kowalski repeated, his accent terrible but his effort genuine. "Mean friend." "Yes, friend." "Tomodachi," he said again, then looked at her with surprising intensity. "We are Tomodachi? You and me?" The question caught Keiko off guard. Were they friends? Could you be friends with someone who'd recently been your enemy? Someone who belonged to the nation that had bombed your cities, even as your nation had attacked theirs? But looking at Kowalski's open face, his earnest attempt to bridge the language gap, Keiko found herself nodding. "Yes, Tomodachi." His face broke into a huge grin, and he stood up to his full height, which Keiko estimated at around 6'4", and called to his companions. "Hey, Miss Nakamura says we're Tomodachi. That's friends." "That's great, Kowalski," Sergeant Rodriguez said with a wry smile. "Now get back to work before the captain sees you socializing." But something had shifted. Over the next few days, small interactions multiplied. Private Miller brought apples from the mess hall and offered them to the women during yard time. Corporal Washington taught Sachiko how to throw a baseball, laughing delightedly when she actually managed to catch his gentle toss. Kowalski continued his Japanese lessons, often enlisting Keiko as his tutor, paying her with chocolate bars from his rations. Not all the soldiers were friendly. Some kept their distance, their expressions hard with lingering wartime hatred. Some stared with a different kind of intensity that made Keiko uncomfortable, their eyes tracking the women in ways that had nothing to do with friendliness. But Lieutenant Morrison was vigilant, and the ones who crossed boundaries were quickly reassigned elsewhere. It was during the second week that Keiko had her first real conversation with one of the American men. Not just a few words exchanged, but an actual dialogue. She was in the small library that had been set up in one corner of the recreation building, looking through English books to practice reading. Most were too advanced, but she'd found a children's book about a rabbit that seemed manageable. She was sitting in a chair, designed for adults and therefore too large, her feet not quite touching the ground, when someone cleared their throat. She looked up to see a soldier she hadn't met before. He was even taller than most of the others, maybe 6'5", with dark hair and eyes the color of moss. His name tag read Morrison. "You're Lieutenant Morrison's." Keiko searched for the word. "Brother," he supplied. "I'm Captain James Morrison. Sarah told me about you, that you're helping translate for the others. I wanted to thank you for that. It makes everything a lot easier." "It is okay," Keiko said, then corrected herself based on Mrs. Donovan's lessons. "I am happy to help. May I?" He gestured to a nearby chair, and when Keiko nodded, he sat down. The chair creaked under his weight. Even sitting, he towered over her. "What are you reading?" She showed him the children's book, feeling embarrassed. "My English is not good. Children's book is better for me." "Your English is actually pretty good," he said. "Better than my Japanese, which is non-existent." "How did you learn?" "School. In Japan, we study English in school. But I am not good student." She smiled slightly. "I am better at science. At nursing. Sarah said you were a nurse before the war. What was that like?" And somehow, sitting in that too large chair with a book about rabbits in her lap, Keiko found herself talking. She told him about the hospital in Kyoto where she trained, about the long hours and strict supervisors, about the satisfaction of helping patients recover. She told him about volunteering for overseas service, about the field hospital in the Philippines, about the chaos when American forces had broken through their lines. Captain Morrison listened without interrupting, his large frame still and attentive in a way that made her feel heard rather than judged. When she faltered over words, he waited patiently instead of finishing her sentences. "It must have been terrifying," he said when she finished. "Being overrun like that." "Yes, but also," she struggled to express the complicated emotion. "Also relief. We knew we were losing. The war was bad. Very bad. To be captured was scary, but also it meant the war was over. For us, at least." "Do you miss Japan?" The question hit harder than she expected. "Every day," she admitted. "I miss my mother, my brother, my home. But..." She looked around the library at the shelves full of books, at the window showing the clear California sky. "But this place is not what I expected. Americans are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Monsters," she said simply. "Demons. That is what we were told. That Americans are cruel, violent, destroy everything beautiful. But you," she gestured vaguely, "you are just people. Very big people," she added with a small smile. "But people." Captain Morrison laughed, a deep sound that seemed to come from his chest. "I guess we are pretty big compared to you. My sister mentioned that, how small you all seem. She said it's like looking at her when she was in middle school, except you're all grown women." "You are like giants to us," Keiko said. "In Japan, tallest man I know is maybe here?" She held her hand up to indicate roughly 5'9". "You are more than that. All of you. Does it bother you? Being so much smaller?" It was such a direct question, so American in its bluntness. Keiko considered lying, then remembered Mrs. Donovan's lessons about directness. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes. It makes me feel vulnerable, like child. Not like woman, like adult. You understand?" "I think so." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "You know what's funny? We feel vulnerable too in a different way. We don't know how to act around you. We're afraid of being too loud, too rough, too much. We're afraid of accidentally hurting you or scaring you. Sarah told me she has to keep reminding the guys to be conscious of their body language, their volume, their proximity. Because what feels normal to us might feel threatening to you." Keiko hadn't considered that. She'd been so focused on her own feelings of vulnerability that she hadn't thought about how the Americans might be struggling too. trying to navigate this strange interaction between former enemies of such different scales. "That is kind," she said. "That you think about this." "Well, Sarah would kick my ass if I didn't," he said, then immediately looked apologetic. "Sorry, my language." "It is okay." Keiko smiled more broadly now. "I am learning American words. Some are." She searched for how to say it. "Some are more colorful than textbook English." They talked for another 20 minutes about everything and nothing, the weather, the food, the differences between Japanese and American culture. When Captain Morrison finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Miss Nakamura, Keiko, if that's okay, you and the others, you're going to be fine. I know everything is uncertain right now, but I promise we're working on a plan. A good plan, one that gets you home eventually if that's what you want. Or," he hesitated, "or helps you stay here, if that becomes an option." After he left, Keiko sat in the too large chair for a long time, thinking about what he'd said. The idea of staying in America hadn't occurred to her. She'd assumed they'd eventually be repatriated to Japan, sent home once the bureaucracy sorted itself out. But what home would she be returning to? What was left of Kyoto? Was her family even alive? That evening, during dinner, the women were unusually animated. Something had happened during the day while Keiko was in the library, and she'd missed it. "They brought in these huge bags," Yumi explained excitedly. "Clothing. American clothing, but in smaller sizes. They asked us to try things on, to see what fits." "Why?" Keiko asked. Fumiko answered, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and suspicion. "Lieutenant Morrison said we can't wear these canvas clothes forever. She said something about dignity, about treating us like people rather than prisoners. So they got us real clothes." The next morning, boxes were delivered to the barracks. Inside were dresses, skirts, blouses, trousers, sweaters, all in sizes that would actually fit them. Not perfectly, but close enough. The colors were brighter than anything Keiko had worn in years. Blues and greens and soft pinks, patterns with flowers and checks. The women descended on the boxes like children at New Year, holding up items, trading pieces, exclaiming over materials that felt soft and new. Keiko found a blue cotton dress with white buttons that fit almost perfectly, and when she put it on and looked in the small mirror on the barracks wall, she barely recognized herself. She looked like a person again. Not a nurse, not a prisoner, not a POW. Just a woman in a blue dress. "You look pretty," Yumi said, coming to stand beside her in a green skirt and white blouse. "We look like civilians." "Maybe that's the point," suggested Tomoko, adjusting the collar of her dress. "Maybe they want us to remember we're civilians, that the war is over." That afternoon, when they went to their English class, Mrs. Donovan clapped her hands together when she saw them. "Oh, you all look wonderful. So much better than those awful canvas things. You look like yourselves again." The comment stuck with Keiko. Looking like themselves. Who were they now in this in-between space? Too far from Japan to be Japanese in the way they'd been, too foreign in America to ever fully belong here. They existed in a liminal zone, shaped by a war that had ended but whose consequences continued to ripple outward. During class, Mrs. Donovan taught them the phrase, cultural exchange. She explained that after the war, there would be opportunities for people from different countries to learn from each other, to build bridges instead of bombs. "Some of you might become part of that," she said, looking around at the attentive faces. "You speak both languages. You understand both cultures. That makes you valuable in ways that might not be obvious yet." After class, Keiko lingered while the others filed out. "Mrs. Donovan? May I ask question?" "Of course, dear. Do you think we could stay? In America? If we wanted?" Mrs. Donovan's expression turned sad. "I don't know, Keiko. The laws are complicated, and attitudes toward Japanese people are still very negative in many places. But I hope so. I really hope so. You deserve a chance at a new life, wherever that might be." Walking back to the barracks, Keiko thought about all the small ways she'd begun to adapt. She was learning to ask for things directly instead of hinting. She was getting used to the scale of everything, the abundance, the casual waste that would have been unthinkable in Japan. She was learning to be less formal, to smile more freely, to engage in small talk with strangers. But she was also acutely aware of how she would never fully fit here. The physical reality alone was insurmountable. She would always be small in a land of large people, always looking up, always being careful not to be overlooked or stepped on. The cultural gaps were even wider. The American emphasis on individual achievement versus Japanese collective harmony. The directness versus subtlety, the optimism versus careful pessimism. That night, lying in her bed, Keiko heard Sachiko crying softly in the darkness. She got up and padded over to the girl's bed, sitting on the edge. "What's wrong?" she whispered in Japanese. "I don't know who I am anymore," Sachiko said through tears. "I'm not the person I was in Japan, but I'm not American either. I'm just lost, floating between worlds." Keiko understood exactly what she meant. She took Sachiko's hand, so small, even compared to her own, and held it gently. "Maybe that's okay," she said. "Maybe we don't have to know yet. Maybe we can just be here right now and figure out the rest as we go." It wasn't much comfort, but it was honest. And honesty, Keiko was learning, was more valuable than false certainty in the strange new world where everything, from the size of the people to the nature of everyday existence, challenged everything she thought she knew. In 1945, 6 Japanese nurses emerge as prisoners of war in San Francisco, stunned by the sheer physical size of their American captors, men who tower over them like giants. Keiko Nakamura, our protagonist, navigates this disorienting new world where everything is larger. The soldiers, the buildings, even the food portions. Initially confined to a military facility, the women undergo a gradual transformation. Through English classes, supervised excursions into the city, and eventually volunteer work at veterans' hospitals, Keiko discovers that being small in a land of giants doesn't mean being insignificant. Despite facing prejudice and cultural barriers, she builds unexpected friendships with her former enemies, particularly Captain Morrison, who becomes a trusted mentor. 5 years later, Keiko has become a fully licensed American nurse, respected for her skill and compassion. She's learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. Her journey from terrified prisoner to confident professional embodies the possibility of transformation and belonging in the most unlikely circumstances. A powerful testament to resilience, adaptation, and the human capacity to build bridges across seemingly insurmountable divides. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more compelling narratives about courage, transformation, and the human spirit.